In part one of the Phaedo, we saw Plato's arguments that the soul is eternal. He's trying to reassure his friends that even though he will be put to death very soon, it's not a real problem for him. In fact, it's something that he has been looking forward to. Now, his friends don't challenge his arguments there. We could challenge those. There might be problems with his arguments for the forms and problems for his arguments regarding recollection, but his friends accept those, and they have different concerns, and that's what we'll be exploring in this part. Before we get into the arguments and concerns specifically that his friends raise, Plato gives a warning here about not being a misalog. And the idea is that just as some people become misanthropes, they hate other people because of a few bad experiences with people, then experiences with bad argumentation might also lead one to become a misalog, one who hates argumentation. A misalog, the miso part is hate. The log part there would be from logos or reasoning. And so Plato recognizes that there are people like this, but he says, you know, just because a few people are bad and really good people are rare, the same might be true with arguments. So good arguments might be rare. So I have a friend who says occasionally, I hate everyone. And of course, then she tries to qualify it a little bit, but you've heard people say this. Whenever somebody says, I hate everyone, or I hate all men, or I hate, and then identifies a group, obviously they've had some really bad experiences with people that fit within that group. And so they have this attitude towards the entire bunch. And so Plato says, just because you've had some bad experiences with arguments, maybe you've seen that philosophy can be used to support almost any position. And so you kind of throw up your hands and say, just might as well forget it all and get discouraged. Plato is trying to encourage his friends and say, okay, let's use reason. Let's be careful. Let's evaluate the arguments. Just because there are some bad arguments, we shouldn't become misalogs. And so the failings of some arguments should not lead us into that dangerous position of just giving up on rationality altogether. Giving up on philosophy would be a mistake just because you've seen philosophy used to defend sometimes even crazy positions. Socrates, through the voice of Plato, is saying, don't do that. Don't give up. All right, so what are the concerns that they have? Again, they don't attack his positive arguments for the idea that his soul is going to continue to exist after his body dies, but Semiosis and Cebes still remain unconvinced. So let's consider Semios's concern. And Semiosis says, this is an idea that I've heard, that I found attractive. The soul is like an attunement. This is something from Heraclitus. It's like a harmony. It's produced, that is produced by a well-tuned lyre. So we have Semiosis' description there. But then he says, but you know, if that's true, if the soul is a kind of a harmony, then it's going to perish when the body perishes. So he's not comforted right now as he considers this possible way of conceiving the soul. Now, Socrates goes ahead and just demolishes Semios's position here, the concern. He provides three criticisms. And so let's take them one by one. The first criticism is that, well, wait a minute, Semiosis, that's inconsistent with other beliefs that you hold. And you hold those firmly. Semiosis was on board with this theory of recollection. So the idea that the soul existed prior to the body, and that's inconsistent with his own belief. So that would be problematic. Here's another concern that's even worse, right? That the idea that the soul is a harmony is actually self-refuting. So Socrates provides this argument. Now look, with that idea that the soul is a harmony, part of the motivation is the idea that virtue is harmonious. And Semiosis agrees with this. So if virtue is a greater harmony, then that would imply that the soul, which is a harmony, must be capable of becoming more harmonious, right? If the soul can become more virtuous, that means it could become more harmonious. But if the soul is a harmony, then that would mean it's capable of becoming more fully a soul. And then, of course, if vice is a disharmony, which follows on this idea, then the soul, which is a harmony, must be capable of becoming disharmonious. And of course, that doesn't make sense. A disharmonious harmony is inconsistent. So if the soul is a harmony, it's becoming capable of becoming less completely a soul. And again, a soul on its own can't become more fully a soul or less completely a soul. That's what it is. It's a soul. And so we have the conclusion that the soul is not a harmony. We really have two lines of thought here, one about the soul becoming more and less of a soul, and the other one, that inconsistency, direct inconsistency with the soul becoming both disharmonious and also being a harmony, which doesn't make sense. Now, Socrates doesn't stop there. He actually has then this third concern that he raises for Semiosis. He says, wait a minute, on this view, your view of the soul, doesn't the soul direct the body and what to do? And doesn't the soul sometimes conflict with the body? For example, somebody might be thirsty, but their soul directs them not to drink yet. Or they may be hungry and the soul says, no, it's not the time to eat, so I'm going to ignore the body. So the soul sometimes conflicts with the body, but if the soul is a harmony, that doesn't make sense, right? Harmony could not be conflicting with or be out of tune with the playing of the strings, which would be the body in this analogy. Whatever the strings play would just be the harmony. So you could not have this opposition between the soul and the body. That just couldn't be possible on this view. So that view is thoroughly destroyed. But Cebes has a different concern. Cebes says, okay, suppose we accept the idea, the theory of recollection as an explanation of knowledge, and the idea that the soul pre-existed one's birth. And so the soul's going to be a lot like Socrates describes it. It existed prior to birth, but it still could perish at some time. And Cebes makes this analogy. He says, just as a garment is to the body, so might the body be to the soul. And so the idea here is that somebody has several garments through their lifetime, a coat that might last a couple of years. So someone goes through several different coats. But if they finally die, which we know happens to everyone, it would be crazy for someone to say, oh no, he can't be dead. I see his coat is still there, right? Eventually, you run out of garments, so to speak. Your body dies, even though the garment continued to survive. Now, it's not that the body continues to survive, but the idea here is that the soul may go through several bodies, be not typically reincarnated in the normal sense of the word. Transmigrated might be a better term, but the soul might exist through a few different existences, but still perish at the end. And so the soul might recur, but still not be eternal. Now, this is a much more significant concern than the one that Semiosis raised. And so Socrates needs to respond to it, and his response is related to the ideas of the forms. So think about how the forms work. The forms work by participation. The forms participate in what exists in the material realm. And that's the way that Socrates explains change and the nature of what we experience. So keep in mind the driving theme of the metaphysics of the pre-Socratics was how do you explain change, or the nature of change, or even the idea from Parmenides and Zeno that change is impossible. And Socrates has come up, or rather Plato has come up with the idea of the forms to explain change. You have forms maybe participating at one time and then not at another. So it's the form of beauty that causes something to be beautiful. It's not something that you could describe by going into the patterns that are there, colors. It's because it's participating in the form of the beauty, or rather the form of beauty participates in the material. So the form of heat is what causes the fire to be hot. And the form of the body is the soul. And so Cebes agrees with this, that the form of the body is the soul. Now, this is something that Aristotle is going to run with, but in a different, with a different concept of the soul. So if the form of the body is the soul's, then we need to think about the nature of form. So let's again put it into a different context. Fire cannot take the opposite of its primary form. Fire, in other words, cannot become cold. Instead, the cold, the form of cold, and the form of the fire, or the fire itself, sorry, the material fire, separates. They retreat from one another. Similarly with the snow, you can't have hot snow. The form of the cold retreats, right? So they separate. Instead of snow becoming hot or fire becoming cold, they separate from the form. And snow can't take on that form of heat. So what is it that is the soul? It's the soul is the form of life. It is itself a form. And so it's the form of life, and the soul, having the form of life, cannot take the form of death. It would be just as contradictory as snow becoming hot and fire becoming cold. And I know technically there's something called cold fire. It looks like fire, but it's plasma. It's not really fire, but that's an aside we need not worry about. So here is the argument for Cebes, where the view is finally rejected and then Cebes is comforted. So the soul has life as its primary or essential form. It is life. That's what it is. And so the soul cannot take the form of death. It's simply impossible, which means that the soul is deathless. And of course, that means that the soul is immortal. It is eternal. It cannot be something that can be put to death. Now, this is consistent with what Socrates said about the soul earlier in his arguments, that it is simple so that it cannot decay, it cannot be separated from itself like material things. So Semiosis and Cebes are comforted. They aren't misologues. They have pursued the arguments, even though it was taking them in a position that they didn't want to hold, because they didn't want to think that this was the absolute end of Socrates. And so they succeed in continuing to be philosophers. At the end of the Phaedo, the dialogue, we have the death scene. And one of the characters asks Socrates, well, what should we do with you after you die? You know, asking about the body. And Socrates laughs and makes a joke about, well, you're going to have a hard time finding me, you know, to do anything with me, because I'm going to be gone, right? His soul's going to be gone. In terms of the body, who cares, right? The body is going to decay, and that's not really an issue. And Socrates, throughout the dialogue, just continues to be more concerned about his friends. He's trying to comfort them instead of the other way around. He's trying to reassure them that he's dying well. In fact, he has concerns about crying and wailing. And so Socrates sends the women out expecting them to start crying and wailing, but of course his male friends start crying as well. So he rebukes them and he tells them they need to shut up and be quiet so he can die well. And the very last statement recorded of Socrates is, "We owe a cock to Asclepius." Now, Asclepius is a god of healing. And what you do is you offer a chicken, a cock, a rooster, when you are healed from a disease. And so Socrates is saying, I'm finally healed from my body entrapping me. I'm going to be released finally, and I'm not going to return to the material world. So he's saying he's freed from his body, and he meets his death, of course, with honor and integrity, the way that he lived his life.